A woman who had lost everything, her health, her money, 12 years of her life, her place in her community, whispered something to herself before she moved. Not a prayer out loud, not a declaration to anyone around her, just a quiet, private thought. If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. And that whisper changed everything. Today, we're unpacking self-talk as the smallest, greatest, and last resort act of faith in the story of the woman with the hemorrhage. What the text actually says, what it meant in her world, and why that inner voice is so much more loaded than it looks. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the cultural stakes she was defying, why her self-talk was both the least and the most she could offer, and what that means for anyone who's ever had to talk themselves into taking one more step. I've got someone here who's been sitting with...
So the story appears in 3 of the 4 Gospels, Mark 5, 25 through 34, Matthew 9, 20 through 22, and Luke 8, 43 through 48. And the core facts are pretty stark. A woman has been bleeding for 12 years. She has suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors. She has spent everything she had, and she has only gotten worse.
12 years. That's not a short illness. That's a decade plus of her life.
Right, and the duration matters enormously when you understand what that condition meant in her world. Under Levitical law, specifically Leviticus 15, 25 through 27, a woman with a chronic blood discharge was considered ritually unclean. Not just personally inconvenienced, ceremonially, legally, socially excluded.
Okay, so what does ritually unclean actually look like in practice? Like, day to day?
She could not enter the temple. She could not go to the synagogue. She could not fellowship with others in any normal way. And here's the part that really hits. Everything she touched became unclean. Every person she made contact with became unclean. So she was not just sick, she was legally untouchable, and she made others untouchable too.
So she's been living in this kind of enforced isolation for 12 years.
Completely. Group Bible study puts it this way. She couldn't sleep in a normal bed, couldn't stay with friends, couldn't be accepted anywhere. She had spent all her money on doctors and was no better. She was broke, isolated, and getting worse. And then she hears about Jesus.
And this is where the self-talk comes in.
This is exactly where it comes in. Before she moves, before she touches anything, she says something to herself. Mark 5:28 records it. If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured. That's it. That's the whole statement. It's not a prayer directed at God. It's not a declaration to the crowd. It's an internal thought, a mental dialogue she has with herself before she acts.
And she's in a crowd, right? Like, this isn't a quiet moment.
No, it's chaotic. Jesus is on his way to heal Jairus' daughter, a synagogue leader's child who is dying. There's urgency. There's a crowd pressing in on him. And she has to push through all of that, knowing that every person she brushes against becomes ceremonially unclean because of her. She is breaking social and religious law just by being there.
Wait, so she's not just sick and desperate, she's actively doing something that could get her in serious trouble.
Exactly. And here's something that I think gets overlooked. The story of the hemorrhaging woman is actually embedded inside the story of Jairus' daughter. It interrupts it. McLaren's Expositions, one of the classic biblical commentaries, notes that this interruption itself is theologically significant. It shows, in McLaren's words, that Jesus had leisure of heart to feel for each, and full of power for all. He stopped an urgent mission to notice one woman who was trying not to be noticed.
That's a wild detail. She's trying to be invisible, and he stops everything.
She would have slipped away if she could. McLaren describes her as a poor, shrinking creature, broken down by long illness, made more timid still by many disappointed hopes. She lets Jesus pass before she can even make up her mind to approach. Then she creeps up behind him. The self-talk came before the courage. It's what made the courage possible.
So the self-talk is the hinge. It's the thing that happens between paralysis and movement.
That's a really precise way to put it. And it connects to something that Dr. Stephen R. Cook writes about at Thinking on Scripture. He points out that the Bible actually contains a lot of passages that address what we today call self-talk. Passages in Genesis, Deuteronomy, Samuel, the Psalms. And he makes this observation that self-talk is never neutral. It always has a bias. It aligns either with God, with personal desires, or with the fallen world around us.
And hers aligned toward God?
Hers aligned toward God, even though it was small, even though it was private, even though it was the last thing she had left to give.
Oh, I want to sit with that for a second. The last thing she had left. Because I think that's the part that makes this story feel different from a lot of faith stories. She's not coming from a place of strength.
No, she's not. And this is where a really important piece of scholarship comes in. In 2025, Kelly Marie Wohl completed a master's thesis at Harvard Divinity School titled The Body and the Blood, a theological reinterpretation of the hemorrhaging woman. And her central argument is that traditional theology has actually reduced this woman to a symbol or a theological device, overlooking who she actually was.
What do you mean, reduced her to a symbol?
Wohl argues that she's been used as a stand-in for faith in the abstract, rather than being seen as a specific person, impure, poor, lonely, and unnamed. And her thesis asserts that it was precisely her marginality, not despite it, that positioned her for a unique and meaningful relationship with God. Vulnerability, she argues, can bring one closer to the divine.
So her weakness wasn't an obstacle to faith, it was the condition for it.
That's the argument. And it reframes the self-talk completely. When she says, "If I just touch his clothes, I shall be cured," she's not speaking from confidence. She's speaking from the edge. That "if" is doing a lot of work. It's not certainty. It's a desperate, fragile hope.
And yet it was enough.
And yet it was enough. Immediately, the text says, her bleeding stopped. She felt in her body that she was healed. And Jesus, aware that power had gone out from him, turns around and asks who touched him.
Which must have been terrifying for her.
The text says she came forward in fear and trembling. She fell down before him and told him the whole truth. She had been trying to be invisible, and now she's standing in front of a crowd, exposed. And what does he say? "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction."
He calls her daughter.
He calls her daughter. And according to Father Abraham Mutholath's interpretation at BibleInterpretation.org, that word is doing enormous theological work. By calling her daughter, Jesus restores her not only to health, but to belonging, affirming her dignity and inclusion in God's family. She came in as someone who was legally untouchable. She left as someone's daughter.
That's a complete reversal of everything her condition had defined her as.
Total reversal. And it all traces back to that one private thought she had before she moved. That's what I mean when I say self-talk is the smallest, greatest, and last resort act of faith in this story. It was the smallest thing, a whisper to herself. It was the greatest thing, it set everything in motion. And it was the last resort, she had nothing else left.
I want to push on something here though, because someone listening might say, okay, but she also touched his garment. Isn't the action the faith? Why are we focusing on the self-talk?
That's a fair challenge. And I think the answer is that the action was the expression of the faith, but the self-talk was the origin of it. She didn't move until she had that thought. The thought preceded the touch. And Jesus himself doesn't say, "Your touch has healed you." He says, "Your faith has healed you." The faith was internal before it was physical.
So the touch was just the faith made visible.
Exactly. And there's a connection here to something Dr. Cook writes about at Thinking on Scripture. He notes that David, in the Psalms, repeatedly directed his own thoughts toward God when he was under pressure. In Psalms 13, 42, and 131, David is essentially his own biblical counselor, applying what he knows to stabilize his own soul. That's self-talk, functioning as a spiritual act.
So this isn't a one-off thing in the Bible. There's a whole pattern of people talking themselves toward God.
There really is. And Dr. Cook makes the point that self-talk is never neutral. It always has a direction. The woman's self-talk had a direction. It was pointed toward Jesus, even if it was quiet, even if it was uncertain, even if it was the last thing she had.
There's also something interesting about the tzitzit connection, right? Like, her belief about touching the hem of his garment wasn't random.
Right, and this is a detail that BibleInterpretation.org highlights. In Jewish tradition, the tassels worn on garments, called tzitzit, were described in Numbers 15, 37 through 41 as reminders of God's commandments. The hem of a garment carried religious significance. So when she reaches for the hem of his cloak, she's not just grabbing at fabric, she's reaching for something she understands to be connected to divine authority and holiness. Her act of faith was culturally and theologically informed.
So she knew what she was doing. It wasn't desperation without understanding.
That's the point Father Mutholath makes. Her act was not superstition. It was a profound recognition of Jesus' divine authority and holiness. She understood the symbolism. She just didn't have the standing by any social or religious measure to approach him directly. So she reached for the hem.
And that's actually kind of heartbreaking, right? She knew enough to know she shouldn't be there, and she went anyway.
She went anyway, and I think that's where the last resort framing really lands. She had tried everything else, she had spent everything, she had gotten worse. This was not her first attempt at healing, it was her final one. And the only thing she had left to offer was that one private thought.
Let me bring in something from the research on faith and mental health, because I think it connects here. There's this concept called positive religious coping. What does that actually mean?
So NeuroLaunch, drawing on more than 2 decades of peer-reviewed research, describes positive religious coping as using faith as a source of comfort, meaning, and community, feeling supported by God, finding spiritual meaning in suffering. And the research shows that people who cope this way fare significantly better in mental health outcomes than those who experience their suffering as divine punishment or abandonment.
So the direction of the self-talk matters. Not just that you're talking to yourself, but what you're saying.
Exactly. And the woman's self-talk was oriented toward hope, not toward shame. She didn't say, "I am unclean and I deserve this." She said, "If I touch his clothes, I will be healed." That's a fundamentally different internal posture. It's reaching towards something, rather than collapsing under the weight of what she'd been told she was.
That's a really important distinction, because she had every reason to internalize the shame. 12 years of being told she was unclean, that gets into you.
It does, and this is where Wohl's Harvard thesis is so valuable. She argues that traditional theology has missed this by turning the woman into a symbol. When you actually look at her as a person, unnamed, broke, isolated, sick, the fact that her self-talk was still oriented toward healing rather than toward shame is remarkable. That's not a small thing.
It's actually kind of defiant.
It is defiant. And BibleAnalysis.org, writing about Christian affirmations, makes this point that faith-based declarations go beyond positive thinking. They're grounded in something the person believes to be true about God. The woman's self-talk wasn't wishful thinking. It was a declaration rooted in what she had heard about Jesus. She had heard about him. That's what Mark 5:27 says. She had heard about Jesus. The self-talk was built on information she had received and chose to act on.
So it's not just emotion, it's informed. She had a reason for what she said to herself.
She had a reason, and that's what makes it faith rather than just hope. Hope is wanting something to be true. Faith is acting as if it is, based on what you know. She knew something about Jesus. She told herself something based on that knowledge, and then she moved.
I want to go back to the moment after the healing, because I think it's easy to skip over what Jesus does next. He doesn't just let her go.
He doesn't. And this is one of the most theologically interesting moves in the whole passage. She's healed, she knows it, she wants to disappear, and he stops the crowd and asks who touched him. His disciples think it's a strange question. There are people pressing in on him from every side, but he keeps looking, and she comes forward.
Why does he do that? Why not just let her have the healing quietly?
McLaren's Expositions wrestles with exactly this question. McLaren calls it strange kindness, strangely contrasted with Jesus' ordinary care to avoid notoriety and his ordinary tender regard for shrinking weakness. And the interpretation is that he wanted her to stand before the community, not to expose her, but to restore her. She had been invisible for 12 years. He made her visible, and then he called her daughter.
So the public moment wasn't punishment, it was restoration.
It was full restoration. Physical healing was one thing. But being called daughter in front of a crowd, that was social and spiritual restoration. She came in as someone who made others unclean. She left as someone who belonged.
And none of that happens without the self-talk, without that one private thought before she moved.
None of it. The self-talk was the first domino, and it was the smallest one. That's what I keep coming back to. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a public prayer. It was a quiet, private, uncertain thought. If I just touch his clothes. That if is still in there. She's not certain, she's hoping, and she moves anyway.
I think that's actually the most relatable part of this story for a lot of people. The if. The uncertainty that doesn't stop you.
And that's what McLaren calls the power of feeble faith. That's actually the title of his exposition on this passage, The Power of Feeble Faith. The faith doesn't have to be strong, it just has to be directed. It just has to move you.
The power of feeble faith, that's a phrase that should probably be on a wall somewhere.
It really should. And it connects to what the topical Bible notes about faith and healing across the New Testament. Jesus says to the blind men in Matthew 9, "According to your faith will it be done to you." Not according to the size of your faith, not according to the eloquence of your prayer, according to your faith. The woman had faith. Small, trembling, last resort faith. And it was enough.
Okay, so let me try to pull this together because I think there are a few threads here that are worth naming clearly. We've got the historical context, 12 years, ritual uncleanness, total social exclusion. We've got the act itself, pushing through a crowd she had no right to be in. And we've got the self-talk, the private thought that preceded all of it.
And then we've got the response, Jesus stopping, finding her, calling her daughter, which is the part that completes the arc. The self-talk initiated the movement produced the healing, and the healing produced the restoration. But the restoration was bigger than the healing. She didn't just get her body back, she got her place back.
And the Harvard thesis from Wowell is making the argument that we've been missing that we've been so focused on the miracle that we've missed the person.
Right. Wowell's argument is that by reducing her to a symbol, traditional theology has overlooked that her marginality, being impure, poor, lonely, unnamed, was not incidental to the story. It was central to it. Her vulnerability was what positioned her for this encounter, and her self-talk was the voice of that vulnerability, reaching towards something it couldn't fully see yet.
That's a really different way of reading it. Usually the story gets told as, look how great her faith was. But Wowell is saying, look how broken she was, and look what that brokenness made possible.
Exactly. And that reframes the self-talk too. It's not the self-talk of someone who has it together, it's the self-talk of someone who has nothing left. And that's actually the most honest kind of faith, the kind that doesn't pretend to be more than it is.
I want to ask about the counter-argument here, because I think someone could push back and say, well, she got healed. Not everyone who talks themselves into reaching for something gets what they're reaching for. How do you hold that tension?
That's a real tension, and I don't think the story resolves it neatly. What the story does is show one instance where the smallest act of faith, a private thought, a trembling reach, was met with something. But the research on positive religious coping from NeuroLaunch is careful about this too. It notes that faith doesn't replace professional care, and that outcomes vary. What the research does show is that orienting yourself toward hope rather than shame, that internal posture, consistently produces better outcomes, even when the miracle doesn't come.
So the self-talk matters regardless of the outcome.
The self-talk matters regardless of the outcome, because it determines whether you move at all. And moving, reaching, is itself something. The woman could have stayed at the edge of the crowd. She could have watched Jesus pass and gone home. The self-talk is what got her into the crowd.
So when you step back from all of this, the 12 years, the isolation, the whisper, the touch, the word daughter, what does this story actually say about the relationship between self-talk and faith?
Here's what I think it says. Self-talk is not a secondary thing. It's not the warm-up before the real act of faith. In this story, it is the act of faith. It's the moment where a person who has been told she is nothing, who has been excluded and depleted and made invisible, says something to herself that points toward the possibility of being made whole. That's not small. That's everything.
And it's private. Nobody hears it. Nobody validates it. She just says it to herself and moves.
Nobody hears it. And yet, it sets in motion something that ends with her being publicly named, publicly restored, publicly called daughter. The smallest thing produced the greatest outcome. That's the arc of the story.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. We spend a lot of time looking for the big moments of faith, the dramatic prayers, the public declarations, the visible acts of courage. But this story is saying that sometimes the most significant thing you do is the thing nobody sees, the thought you have before you move.
And Dr. Cook's point at thinking on scripture is worth returning to here. Self-talk is never neutral. It always has a direction. The question isn't whether you're talking to yourself, you are. The question is what you're saying and where it's pointed. The woman's self-talk was pointed toward healing, toward Jesus, toward the possibility that something could change. That direction was the faith.
And the research on positive religious coping backs that up, that orienting yourself toward meaning and hope in suffering, rather than toward shame or abandonment, produces measurably different outcomes.
It does. And the woman in this story is, in a sense, the ancient version of that. She had every reason to orient toward shame. 12 years of being told she was unclean. 12 years of failed treatments. 12 years of isolation. And instead, she said to herself, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. That's a choice. A small, private, trembling choice. And it was the right one.
I keep thinking about Wohl's framing, that her vulnerability was what positioned her for this encounter. There's something in that for anyone who's ever felt like their weakness disqualifies them from something.
That's the inversion at the heart of the story. She thought her condition excluded her. And in one sense, by every social and religious rule of her time, it did. But her condition was also what drove her to reach when she had nothing left to lose. The exclusion became the opening. The weakness became the posture of faith.
Okay, so here's where I want to land. If someone is listening to this and they're in a season where they've tried everything, spent everything, and they're still not better, what does this story actually offer them?
It offers them permission to have feeble faith, to say the small, uncertain thing to themselves, to not wait until they feel strong enough or certain enough or worthy enough. The woman wasn't any of those things. She was broke, sick, excluded, and trembling, and she moved. The self-talk didn't require her to have it together. It just required her to point herself in a direction.
And the if is allowed to stay in the sentence.
The if is allowed to stay. If I just touch his clothes, I shall be cured. She didn't say, I know I will be cured. She said if, and that was enough. McLaren called it the power of feeble faith. The faith doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to move you.
The faith just has to move you. I think that's the line this whole episode has been building toward.
And what's remarkable is that the movement, the reaching, is what Jesus honors. He doesn't say your certainty has healed you. He doesn't say your worthiness has healed you. He says your faith has saved you. The faith was in the reaching, and the reaching started with a whisper to herself. So the next time you're at the edge of a crowd you feel like you have no right to be in, talking yourself into one more step, that's not weakness. According to this story, that might be the most significant thing you do all day. Thanks for being here for this one on Co-Pilot Podcasts. The woman in this story never got named, but she got called daughter, and it started with a thought nobody else heard.